our rearview mirror. And for those of you that are working through the chronological Bible, you think you're way ahead of me. But truth of the matter is, last year I did Revelation back to the prophets in reverse order. So I'm going to be done a lot before you are, I believe. In any case, I want to get back to perspective of history here. We had Genesis, which we know could be as far back as 7,000 years and as little as 2,000 years before Christ. And then we have Job, and then we have Exodus. And when we look at the book of Exodus, we're probably, with the chronological interface, going to be looking at First Chronicles 6, 1 through 3, and also some Leviticus. So we're going to take a look at the book of Exodus, and I think the good thing to do is to recognize that we left in Genesis Joseph in Egypt, and there his family had also come because of the famine. And the Pharaoh that was in charge, the king of Egypt, was very favorable to Joseph and also to his family, and therefore made the Jews very comfortable in Egypt. And when we look at the book of Exodus, that changes because the king of Egypt changes. And his outlook towards the people of Israel is completely different. Now, it's a good idea to keep in mind an outline of the book of Exodus. The first 14 chapters of Exodus represent only 430 years, about 1800 down to 1400 BC. Chapters 15 through 18 only represent 2 months of history, and chapters 19 through 40 only 10 months. So we have way more than half of the book of Exodus, which represents no more than a year. It's chapters 15 through 40, just 1 year in time, versus the first 14 chapters representing 430 years. So it's quite a difference, and you need to remember that history and the fact that we're looking at a long period of time in relative terms in the first 14 chapters and a relatively short period of time in the next 25 chapters. So quite an interesting change there. So we're in chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, and we find in verses 1 through 7 the connection back to the book of Genesis and the historical Jewish life of the people of Israel that are down in Egypt because of famine. In verses 8 through 14, we find a new king, a new Pharaoh in Egypt, who is not favorable to the Israelites. As a matter of fact, he's paranoid. He thinks that the Jews will soon outnumber the Egyptians and that they will not be good for the country. And so he starts to make life really miserable instead of blessing the people of Israel as the previous Pharaoh did when Joseph was serving him. We now have an antagonistic Pharaoh or king. In verses 15 through 17, we find this new vicious Pharaoh or king issuing a mandate to the midwives, that's those that delivered babies, that they would kill all of the male Israel babies, Jewish babies, and leave the females alone, hoping to annihilate the race of Jews in the country. However, the midwives, because of their free will and their fear of God, don't do that. They're not obedient to the Pharaoh or to the king. That's not terribly surprising, is it, when you think about the nature of a woman and how she loves babies? Nevertheless, in chapters 1, verses 18 through 21, God shows protection towards those midwives because of their honoring him, and he provides protection for them. In chapter 1, verse 22, we find man's plan for male Jews, and it's a little different than what God's plan is for the Jews. Man's plan is to annihilate all of the male Jews. God's plan is nothing like it. Now, what do we do to apply this? It seems like a lot of history. Well, the first application that I want you to realize is that the Bible has a tremendous amount of history, which is used frequently in historical writings. However, it is not a history book. It does not take world history into account. It predominantly settles on a small area around Israel. And while it is not a history book, it contains incredible amount of history, which is used by historians today. Secondly, I think we can recognize the damage that one man can make when he's evil. This Pharaoh king that replaced the one that Joseph served, he destroys the hope of the Jew in Egypt. And so we can see what one evil man can do when he's given power and authority. We certainly have seen that down through the history of Stalin and Hitler. We've seen that in many days in states where corruption crept in here in the United States, and where one man caused tremendous harm. Third application is that God's will often takes a push of man. So God's will, what was it? God wanted the nation of Israel to be in the promised land. They weren't. They were down in Egypt. They had gone down there because of famine instead of trusting God for their provision. And now God wanted to move them back to the promised land. And God's will is always done. Man sometimes has to get a little shove, and that's exactly what's happening here. Life is miserable in Egypt, and they want to get out of Egypt, and therefore they're going to wind up back going to the promised land. I think most of us have had times in our lives when we've seen that God had to give us a little push to get us where he wanted us to be. I know he's certainly done that in my life a couple of times. When I wasn't where he wanted me to be geographically, he gave me a little push and made it look like it was my choice to get back on his plan. But in fact, it was really his plan and a little bit of his pushing. And then finally, I think the fourth thing that we need to understand about applying this first chapter in the book of Exodus is that God protects those who fear him. I think when you go back and read through chapter 1 and you see these midwives who went against the king's wishes, who put their own lives at risk because they feared God and the taking of life against God's will, that God protected them. Now, we know there are lots of martyrs, that God doesn't always protect those who stick their necks out and take a position for God. But I think it's interesting to see how often God does protect those who turn to him and who fear him and will do the will of God instead of the will of man and do the right thing instead of the wrong thing, and how often God protects them and gets them through that. So I think there's a lot of good application in chapter 1. It's not just a historical backdrop of how Joseph and the people of Israel got down in Egypt, and now they're going to be pushing their way out of Egypt and into the promised land. But it has some wonderful applications for us to see the nature and character and attributes of God. So remember, not a history book, but a tremendous amount of history. And we're now back. We took a little microscopic look at Job, one person, and now we're back as if we had just completed reading the book of Genesis. And we're looking at the residuals of Joseph and his family and the multiplication of Jews in the nation of Egypt, and how God is going to get them out of Egypt and back into the promised land. That's my thought for the day. God bless you and have a great day.